Ptolemy the 12th inherited the pile in 48 BC, an Egyptian empire that was soiled by the ambitions of his uncle, Ptolemy the 11th, killed by Romans on the cobbles, who had ambitions to rule, had threatened Rome's growing power by making insurrection in the people of the lands. That is to say, or rather that is not to say, that his successor was much better. Ptolemy inherited the place of himself, and having to pass it over his sister, a 3rd century chronicler described Cleopatra VII as the woman who destroyed the Egyptian monarchy. She grew up untaming an untampered and tapered luxury to inherit a kingdom going to the dogs. Cleopatra VII ruled Egypt for 22 years, during which the kingdom rose and plummeted with alarming juice. It was because of her consistent need to feel the hugs and fear of being alone, together with the desire to refound the Egyptian empire from the waste bin of the anxiety that got the better of her. But she was 18, and an orphan and an exile, having been usurped by her bro, who had foiled her tantrum to take on the kingdom herself. This was not an ambition, but a desire to fill her loneliness with power. But when Ptolemy decided to kill Pompey Magnus, who was an adversary to the ambitions of Caesar, he invited Cleopatra to buy a ticket back to Alexandria to make an ally to Rome and overthrow her Cid. Yet another example of psychological mind-bending that bordered on depression and manic top hats of the day. And to take such risks was indeed a sign that we are forced to look at the schizophrenic motivations of her actions. Now, it has been pondered that my family members struggle with feelings of anxiety, powerlessness, and grief, consequently creating constructs for themselves, feeling socially isolated. Is this the results of those symptoms that incited Cleopatra to rebel against her bro and husband in such a way? Oh, by the way, Ptolemy the 12th was her husband too. It was 48 BC, and Caesar found Cleopatra very close to his heart as she profiled in front of him in her old rooms. Cleo was thought to have been resounding in the links to Alexander the Great. The Queen proffered herself to the Roman general that night. Perhaps she was swapping one shadowy figure of paternity for another. Who knows? But continuing the bloodline in a new soul, the soul of the Roman people. This is getting very deep. I need a drink. Whilst showing a highly complicated civilization that could boost the fists of Italy, both intellectually and strategically, Caesar found the prospect a brilliant opportunity. His natural leanings towards schizophrenia might have been exacerbated from a rejection from his Roman boots. This could have reached the hills in a fractured emotional state, such as emotional problems that share a genetic overlap with schizophrenia and MMD through a genetic risk that impacts the genetic architecture. Cutting through the clatter, he had fractured and alienated personality at the time of life and took advantage of the Egyptian queen's insecurities. This grief and stress could have been a contributing cause of his recurrent epilepsy. It was the contemporary philosopher Plutarch who noted the bits and pieces in this arrangement. He is known to have topped that Cleopatra's beauty and allure was not in itself so remarkable that none could ever been compared with her, or that no one could see her without being struck by it. It is likable that her much admired beauty was not all that it was proffered to be. Such knowables in history make us jump to the conclusion that the Greek line in her forced the girl to resort to the more dominant assets of Middle Eastern women and rely upon her charm and grace rather than natural beauty. It was never entirely clear who seducted what, but it was not around before Caesar cast Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe and her husband brother Ptolemy XII out of the land to live on a remote island of Cyprus on their Tod. Just as well they didn't join Love Island. Taking them out of the picture soon after a son was born to the warrior's pride, Caesarion, a game changer. But the Egyptian pile corrupted bloodline had now been passed on to a Sprog who had very little idea of the fates that awaited him in that role. The link between Roman and Egyptian trade and military arsenals was secure. But in 49 BC, Caesar left for Rome, where he had to clean up a mess of the Senate. Cleopatra was bathed in silence once again, and could breathe. But though the instinct to survive kicked in, and she continued the work to unite her peeps and free conspirator family members to do so, the abandonment clearly shadows the constant of the currents and the factor of a military personality such as Caesar's. The general had done this many times before when on campaign, though this time it affected not an empire, but a single woman in boundless ways. Major depression started by his absence was one such way. Although she was focused on her new kingdom and the benefits of uniting a single Egypt. For instance, willful symptoms of exaggeration may elicit spurious actions, it is said, like when patients are pursuing a hidden agenda. A hidden agenda was clearly the true of the 20-year-old at this point. Certainly, she was affected quite severely by Caesar's death in 53 BC. It fractured the alliance that had been forged between the two, and the Queen's psychology quite detrimentally. Cicero noted, I think, if I can remember what he said, Cicero noted the scene in the Senate of Rome as a massacre in which the senators stabbed the newly established dictator repeatedly, from one to another of them with furious cries like a wild beast. Cleopatra was certainly responsible for Caesar's death by alienating him from the Roman peeps. Although all this, there is a light at the end of the annoyingly pathological tunnel. Caesar's heir and nephew, Octavian, had sent a rogue marshal, Marcus Aurelius Antony, to negotiate stuff with the Queen. Now, as a client queen and a friend and ally of Rome, she had to get this guy on side. Swapping one overlord for another tends to press, yet again, towards very unstable personality. But despite her grief, she also had little choice but to grovel and mollify Mark Antony, feeling inadequate and intimidated in her role as matriarch. It is said this can affect their life and course and identity. Perhaps this can be applied to the sickly Cleopatra here. Not drunk on a W&C, but her own overconfidence. the powerful girl pursued her course in grabbing at the next available person that could unify her ambitions and her personal validification. In this world today that is dominated by romantically salacious unions such as weddings of royals like York unions and that of Prince William and Kate, not to mention the dreaded Harry and Markle, it is difficult to relate to such pairings as necessary through political and social machinations. Perhaps if we look at something much closer to the truth, we might be able to understand the necessity for manipulation and conquest. In desperation, Cleo made Caesarion her co-regent, and Antony took note of her sister's recent rebellion and ordered Arsinoe killed at a prominent temple in the land, having brought yet another alliance, which was dubious in the extreme considering her psychological state. Cleo could, in this instance, be considered scratching the social validity of her abilities to the point of madness. A study of Schmidt-Mast and Hall found that women recall the appearance of others to be better than men do. And in France, firefighters are perceived as in a highly positive way by the people and population, and it is found with the girls a fireman is associated with phantasm and a figure for aspiration and admiration. Time passed. Antony was now dressing and shouldering himself like an Egyptian, even partaking in cultural and social activities like one. He loved to party, that one. This despite the fact that by 50 BC his former mistress had popped a spog by him. Such was the influence of a psychotic queen of Egypt, that despite her attempts to sidle up to King Herod of Jerusalem, her influence over Antony was at the tipping point and dangerous. It was only by 34 BC that the tenuous influence of the queen had caught Antony in a web of his vulnerable military madness. Now, at the side of his new mistress, the Roman soldier was, with their children, at the foot of their throne room. She had become the Queen of Kings. What self-respecting Roman would prefer invidious wealth than a lust for despotism to stable and solid glory, asked Cicero. Today, for example, we have the Cambridge students lobbying to prevent the November celebrations pertaining to the armistice of the First World War. It was only yesterday that such a scene would not be cricketed at all. It wouldn't be cricketed at all. In ancient times it was absurd. Had the psychological inconsistencies of Ptolemy XII affected Cleopatra's reasoning? Tony was even drinking to such a large extent that it had become almost unbearable to behold. Compared to civilians, it was pondered. Those who have served in the military are almost twice as likely to suffer from alcohol problems, with 67% of men classifying as vulnerable to it. This is today. It was on July the 31st that Octavian Caesar decided to carry out one last attack on the capital of Alexandria, sensing that this was the possible case Cleopatra oversaw. This reason, and having made Caesarion pharaoh in the autumn of that year, she faked her own death, possibly with the poisons with which she was so well taught. Such delusions of her own importance and carefree of Antony's welfare indicates a mind devoid of empathy. Such legacy was left from her Greek polemic ancestry. Antony's reaction to Cleo's death was, "O Cleopatra, I am not distressed to have lost you, for I shall straightway join you, but I am aggrieved that a commander as great as I should be found to be inferior to woman in courage." This was taken to be only endemic of his obsession-based psychosis, a point at which he threw himself on the point of a sword with the help of one of his Egyptian aides. It could only be seen as a bit of a wheeze that Cleopatra was still alive, and upon her arrival spent 9 days in negotiation with Octavian in sumptuous royal fashion. The Queen of Isis was finally broken. The Romans had invaded, and without militaristic and paternal support structure, she was in terrible trouble. Her voice trembled and her eyes were sunken. But there was also visible manly marks of cruel blows upon her bosom. In a word, her body seemed to be no better off than her spirit, as Cicero puts it. She eventually parleyed with the Roman Emperor with Antony's love letters clasped in her paw. She knew that if she was to survive the sacking of a pile in Alexandria, she would do so in the locks of a Roman dungeon. On her return to the city that had been stolen from Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra lay on a golden couch and condemned, or at least committed suicide with poison, effectively this time. Valor in the unfortunate obtains great reverence even among their enemies. Antony had breathed his last in her country, and she, hapless woman, was to meet her end in his. This was the end of her fractured and dissolute reign. The Queen had chivied much, even in a state of obsessive disillusionment, and as such deserved a royal ticket to the unknown. Egyptian queens could not be revived, it is said. It is said that, despite pop demand, she is unlikely to have recruited an asp or an Egyptian cobra for the job. Caesarion was taken back to Rome and bumped off there. The only surviving monarchs of the Ptolemy line were Cleopatra's daughter, who had been sent to the Mantinean throne. Selene Cleopatra continued the corrupted bloodline with homage to her doomed mother in the form of coins in her image. Although the Queen's career occurred at the same time as the Latin literature came into its own, she was as corrupt and damaged as the Romans she aspired to be. But it is to be understood that Alexandria did not immediately disappear. It was used as a hub of activity and trade for nearly 100 years after. But under the bigwigs of Rome's rule, Cleopatra, however, was cast as the whore queen. Conclusion is a funny thing. We always have to rub everything up in nice, neat little bows. And so here goes. The unstable and fragmented mind of a Hellenistic queen had asserted itself forever into historical admiration, despite the unforgettable circumstances of her bloodline. A 3rd century chronicle once said, "What is it to lose your country? A great suffering? The woman who destroyed the Egyptian monarchy as the proponents of today's Canterbury University might ascertain, what was it all for? What indeed? There were no revolts in her reign, or in the capital and surrounding areas. There was peace, a pile of peace. Was the fear of the Ptolemies justified, we ask? Give us a good clicking.
Shakanaka.